She was the first to unleash that burning cry of "Piece of My Heart" years before Janis Joplin made it a rock anthem that shook the counterculture. She was the eldest Franklin sister, a soul singer with a voice that could rattle the church walls and hush a restless crowd. Yet she lived her life in the long shadow of the Queen of Soul, her younger sister, Aretha Franklin. Irma Franklin's story is one of brilliance overlooked, of dreams interrupted, and of a legacy that refuses to die. She carried within her the thunder of gospel and the tenderness of soul, but time and again, fate and industry conspired to silence her. She wasn't the one the record labels pushed to the front. She wasn't the one history crowned. Instead, she became the hidden foundation, the quiet force standing behind others, her power underestimated, her name too often omitted from the pages of music history. But how could such a voice at once fierce and vulnerable, disciplined yet raw, fade so easily into the margins? How could the woman who first gave the world "Piece of My Heart" be remembered more as a footnote than as the originator? And why do we only rediscover her genius decades later, through chance, commercials, or the echo of someone else's fame? To understand how Irma's journey of brilliance and heartbreak began, we must return to her roots. A childhood shaped by gospel fire, by family upheaval, by loss, and by an unshakable bond with her siblings. We must trace the steps of a young woman who carried both promise and responsibility, who walked onto the stage with hope in her voice, only to watch opportunity slip into the hands of others. This is the story of Irma Franklin, Miss Irma, the woman who gave soul its heart, only to be written in the shadows of history. Irma Vernice Franklin entered the world on the 13th of March, 1938, in the small town of Shelby, Mississippi. From the moment she was born, the odds of her life seemed divided between glory and hardship. She was the eldest daughter of the Reverend C.L. Franklin, a traveling Baptist preacher whose booming sermons could raise roofs and stir hearts across the South, and Barbara Siggers Franklin, a pianist and singer whose artistry poured into her children like a second bloodstream. For the Franklin household, faith and music were inseparable. The pulpit and the piano were the twin poles of existence. And Irma, as the first daughter, would absorb both the blessings and the burdens of that union. Her earliest years unfolded in constant motion. The Franklin family moved from Tennessee to Buffalo, New York, before finally settling in Detroit, Michigan. Each relocation carried with it both instability and opportunity. Wherever the Franklins went, music followed. By the time they reached Detroit, Reverend Franklin had been appointed pastor of the New Bethel Baptist Church. That pulpit became more than just a stage for sermons. It evolved into a powerhouse of gospel music, drawing congregations who left feeling as if heaven itself had brushed against them. Inside those pews, young Irma found her voice. At just 5 years old, she stood in front of a congregation in Buffalo and sang publicly for the first time. Her voice, small yet filled with conviction, carried a depth that startled the adults around her. It wasn't just the innocence of a child's voice. It was something ancestral, something that seemed born to command attention. Soon, she and her younger sisters, Aretha and Carolyn, were known throughout Detroit's church community as the Three Golden Voices. Together, their harmonies electrified Sunday services at New Bethel Baptist, and whispers spread that these Franklin girls were destined for something greater. But behind the soaring music, Irma's childhood was scarred by heartbreak. In 1948, when she was just 10 years old, her parents' marriage collapsed. Barbara left Detroit with Irma's older brother, Vaughn, relocating back to Buffalo. Irma stayed in Detroit with her father and younger sisters. The separation left an invisible wound, a fracture in the family's foundation. Just 4 years later, the wound was torn wide open. Barbara, her mother, passed away in 1952. Irma was 14. The loss crushed her. Suddenly, the gentle guiding hand of her mother, her nurturer, her teacher in music and life was gone forever. As the eldest daughter, Irma shouldered the weight. She became the caretaker in the household, helping raise her younger sisters while navigating her own teenage years. Friends and relatives would later describe her as loyal, quiet, protective, always standing behind others, rarely pushing herself forward. That sense of duty shaped her character, even as it began to form a pattern that would haunt her adult life. Irma as the foundation, while others were pushed into the spotlight. Even amidst grief, Irma never let go of music. By high school, she had gathered a group of friends and formed a vocal group called the Cleopatras. Their sound was bold, spirited, gospel-rooted, yet aimed squarely at the rising tide of rhythm and blues. Touring across Michigan, they won competitions and drew attention wherever they sang. In 1953, the group landed a contract with JVB Records, a small Detroit label owned by Joe Von Battle, the same man who had recorded Reverend Franklin's fiery sermons. That year, the Cleopatras released their first single, Say Would You, Babe, backed with No Other Love. The record never charted nationally, but it offered Irma her first taste of the recording industry. For a time, it looked as if she might become Detroit's next breakout star. Local songwriters Berry Gordy Jr. and Billy Davis took note of her talent, seeing in her the potential to be the female face of their fledgling record company, the company that would one day become Motown. They even took Irma to Chicago to meet Leonard Chess, the formidable head of Chess Records, hoping to secure a distribution deal. But Chess was unmoved. He told them they needed stronger material. The dream collapsed before it could even begin. That trip to Chicago ended in disappointment, and with little money left for the return journey, Gordy and Davis returned to Detroit, disheartened. For Irma, the moment was crushing. She had been on the cusp of something bigger, only to watch it dissolve. It was the first of many times her career would brush against greatness, only to slip away. At this crossroads, Reverend Franklin stepped in. Where Berry Gordy saw a rising star, her father saw a daughter in need of stability. He insisted that Irma finish her education before pursuing music full-time. Torn between ambition and duty, Irma obeyed. She graduated high school with top honors and enrolled at Clark College in Atlanta, Georgia, where she studied business administration and secretarial science. While her friends and sisters in Detroit continued to chase music, Irma found herself in classrooms instead of recording studios. She buried herself in studies, but her heart ached for the stage. And while she was away, fate delivered a cruel twist. Berry Gordy, still impressed with Irma's voice and inspired by her broken relationship, wrote a soul-wrenching ballad called All I Could Do Was Cry. The song was intended for Irma, but with her away at college, Gordy gave it to Etta James. Released in 1960, James's version became a national hit. When Irma returned home and discovered that the song meant for her had made another singer famous, she was devastated. It was a bitter lesson. In music, timing was everything, and hers always seemed to be off. By the dawn of the 1,960 seconds, the Franklin family name was already becoming synonymous with gospel excellence. Reverend Franklin's sermons had been pressed onto vinyl. Aretha, still young, was showing extraordinary promise. The foundation was being laid for the Franklin legacy in American music. Yet for Irma, the dutiful daughter, the caretaker, the singer who had once been poised to break out the story was still one of almosts, of chances deferred, of brilliance forced to wait its turn. By the dawn of the 1,960 seconds, the Franklin family name was already woven into the fabric of gospel culture. Reverend C.L. Franklin's sermons were being pressed onto vinyl, his voice booming through living rooms as well as pulpits. His daughters were already known in Detroit's gospel scene, and the middle child, Aretha, was showing extraordinary promise. Record executives sensed greatness, but they didn't yet realize that more than one Franklin sister carried lightning in her throat. In 1960, Reverend Franklin took his daughters to New York City for auditions. The executives at Columbia Records immediately saw a spark in Aretha, convinced they had found their next jazz pop star. Yet standing beside her that day was Irma, older, steadier, already seasoned from her years with the Cleopatras and her brushes with Berry Gordy. Columbia wasn't entirely blind to her talent. They offered her a contract as well, but not on the prestigious Columbia imprint. Instead, she was shuffled onto Epic Records, Columbia's subsidiary label. That single decision would shape the course of her career. While Columbia poured resources into grooming Aretha as their jewel, Epic didn't know what to do with Irma. She was older, less moldable, her voice rooted in gospel grit and blues, ache rather than the polished pop sound Epic specialized in. To them, she didn't fit neatly into a box. And when the music industry can't find a box for you, it often decides to place you on the shelf. Irma went into the studio to record her debut album, released in 1962 as Her Name is Irma. On paper, it looked like a promising start, but when the music hit the shelves, it was clear Epic had missed the point. Instead of the raw, gospel-drenched soul Irma could deliver, the record was stacked with pop standards and middle-of-the-road ballads. She sang time after time, and every time we say goodbye with warmth and control. But these weren't the kinds of songs that revealed the fire in her. Critics barely noticed the release, and the public didn't bite. Epic released 6 singles from the album's sessions, none of which charted. The record quietly faded, dismissed as another forgettable pop experiment. For Irma, it was another heartbreak. Just as she had missed out on All I Could Do Was Cry, now she was trapped in a contract that forced her to sing music that didn't reflect her true identity. Years later, she would admit that Epic, like Columbia with Aretha in those early years, simply didn't know what to do with black women who carried both gospel roots and pop aspirations. When her contract ended, Epic quietly let her go. There was no fight, no campaign to keep her. To the label, she was expendable. To Irma, it was another door closed before she even had a chance to walk through it. And yet, she did not give up. If record companies wouldn't give her a stage, she would find one elsewhere. Soon, opportunity came through one of the biggest rhythm and blues performers of the day, Lloyd Price. Known for his massive hit, Personality, Price was a star with a touring orchestra that crisscrossed the country. He invited Irma to join his group as a featured vocalist. For the next 5 years, Irma Franklin lived life on the road. Touring with Price wasn't glamorous long bus rides, grueling performance schedules, nights in cramped hotel rooms, but it gave her something Columbia and Epic never did, the chance to sing on her own terms. Night after night, she performed before live crowds, honing her craft, learning the discipline of show business, and studying how to command a stage. Still, even on the road, the spotlight was rarely hers. The marquee carried Lloyd Price's name, not hers. The audiences came for his hits, not for her voice. She was the supporting player, the reinforcement, the one who made the show richer but never reaped the credit. It was the beginning of a haunting pattern that would follow her for life, Irma Franklin as the backbone, but never the headliner. And yet, those years mattered. They forged her resilience. They taught her that she could withstand disappointment and still keep singing. They proved that her voice didn't need industry polish to connect with people. It only needed to be heard. By the mid-1960 seconds, though, it seemed as if Irma's chance at stardom had slipped through her fingers. She had the talent, but timing was never on her side. When Epic released her debut, they didn't believe in her. When Berry Gordy wrote a song for her, she was away at school. When she sang live, she stood behind bigger names. It seemed as though every opportunity that came her way dissolved before it could bloom. Then, in 1967, fate introduced her to a man who recognized what others had overlooked. Bert Burns, a maverick songwriter and producer with a keen ear for soul, met Irma and was stunned by the raw power in her voice. Burns had already written hits for the Drifters, Garnet Mimms, and Van Morrison. But with Irma, he saw untapped potential, a woman who could channel gospel fire into a secular sound and deliver songs that sliced straight into the heart. Burns signed her to his label, Shout Records, a division of Bang Records. For Irma, it was another chance at a breakthrough, another moment where the door creaked open. At first, history seemed determined to repeat itself. Her debut single on Shout, a cover of Jimmy Reed's blues standard Big Boss Man, went nowhere. It seemed like another missed opportunity, another project fated to vanish without recognition. But Burns wasn't finished. He had a song waiting, one that would change everything. Co-written with Jerry Ragavoy, it was called Piece of My Heart. The moment Irma sang it, something shifted. Unlike her polished Columbia ballads or her work in Price's orchestra, here she could unleash the gospel ache and raw power that lived inside her. In that performance, restrained yet fiery, Irma Franklin finally sounded like herself. And for the first time, the world would hear her not as someone else's backup, not as someone else's sister, but as a voice entirely her own. In the fall of 1967, Irma Franklin stepped into a New York studio with producer Bert Burns and songwriter Jerry Ragavoy. They handed her a brand new composition, Piece of My Heart. For most singers, it might have been just another number to deliver. For Irma, it became the canvas where she finally painted in her own colors. Her rendition didn't explode with wild abandon. Instead, it was disciplined. grounded in gospel phrasing and emotional control. She poured into the song both vulnerability and defiance, the ache of someone who had endured loss and disappointment yet still had strength to give. Each line cut like a blade wrapped in silk. It wasn't theater, it was testimony. Released late in 1967 on Shout Records, the single began to climb the charts. For the first time, Irma's name, not just her voice, appeared in print across the nation. On the Billboard R&B chart, the record rose to number 10. On the Hot 100, it reached number 62. The achievement was modest compared to megastars of the day, but for Irma Franklin, it was monumental. After years of watching doors close, here was undeniable proof. Her sound could connect, her voice could sell, her artistry could stand alone. The industry noticed. In 1969, Irma earned a Grammy nomination for Best Female R&B Vocal Performance. It was validation at last, a recognition that she could no longer be ignored. But even this triumph carried a cruel irony. The award that year went not to Irma but to her younger sister, Aretha, for Chain of Fools. Once again, Irma had clawed her way into the spotlight, only to have the crown redirected onto the sister she had supported since childhood. And then fate intervened with devastating force. In December 1967, just as Irma and Burns were preparing to build on the momentum of Piece of My Heart with a full-length album, Burt Burns suddenly died of a heart attack at age 38. The sessions unraveled. Shout Records, left in chaos without its visionary leader, lost direction. Irma was stranded. The breakthrough she had been waiting for had cracked open the door only for it to slam shut again. The cruelest twist came soon after. In 1968, a San Francisco rock band, Big Brother and the Holding Company, recorded Piece of My Heart with their electrifying lead singer, Janis Joplin. Their version was a blast furnace of psychedelic energy, a white-hot explosion that fit perfectly into the counterculture moment. It sold over 1 million copies, became a defining anthem of the late 1960 seconds, and etched Joplin's name permanently into rock history. To the wider world, Joplin's recording became the version of the song. Few realized that Irma Franklin had been the first to give it life, that it was her controlled storm which had made the blueprint. When asked about Joplin's cover, Irma admitted with a mixture of humor and hurt, "I didn't even know it was mine." That sentence captured the essence of her career, moments of brilliance lost in translation, her voice hidden under someone else's fame. Still, for those who knew, Piece of My Heart remains a testament. In Irma's hands, the song was not a scream but a sermon. Where Joplin's version raged, Irma's endured. Where Joplin burned, Irma bled. One embodied chaos, the other embodied grace under fire. This was Irma Franklin's long-overdue breakthrough, a song that should have placed her in the pantheon of soul. Instead, it highlighted the paradox of her life, recognized enough to matter, overshadowed enough to be forgotten. After the sudden death of Burt Burns in December 1967, Irma Franklin's hard-won momentum collapsed. Piece of My Heart had finally given her a breakthrough, but with her champion gone, the sessions for a full-length album dissolved into chaos. Once again, fate had handed her a cruel interruption. Still, the industry hadn't entirely forgotten her. Labels sensed potential after the single's success, and offers began to appear. Among them were RCA Records and Brunswick Records, the Chicago-based label renowned for its soulful productions. Irma chose Brunswick. The decision wasn't just about business, it was about identity. Her younger sister Carolyn was already tied to RCA, and Irma wanted her own path. At Brunswick, she hoped to escape the shadow of comparison and carve out a space truly her own. In 1969, she entered the studio to record what would become her second full-length album, Soul Sister. The very title was loaded with meaning. To some, she was simply Aretha's sister. To others, she was Carolyn's elder. But with this record, Irma sought to declare herself not as someone's sibling, but as a soul sister in her own right. The album was drenched in the lush arrangements of Chicago soul, courtesy of producers Carl Davis and Sonny Sanders. Irma tackled covers with a distinct voice, transforming familiar songs into something new. Her version of Jimmy Webb's By the Time I Get to Phoenix carried aching vulnerability. She reimagined The Doors' Light My Fire, replacing extended rock organ solos with gospel-driven intensity and searing saxophone riffs. On Son of a Preacher Man, recorded even before Aretha's own rendition, Irma shimmered with authenticity, as if singing not just about romantic longing but also her complicated bond with her father, Reverend C. L. Franklin. But Soul Sister wasn't only about reinterpretation. It gave Irma space for her own sound. The standout track, Got to Find Me a Lover, 24 Hours a Day, delivered urgency and funk wrapped in rhythmic confidence. Released as a single in April 1969, it climbed to number 40 on the Billboard R&B chart and even reached number 20 inches the UK, giving Irma her first taste of international recognition. For a brief moment, it seemed the world might finally catch up to her. And yet, behind the promise, frustration brewed. In a 1973 interview with Blues and Soul magazine, Irma revealed her deep disappointment with Brunswick. When she was first signed, the label seemed excited, full of big plans. But once the single was out, communication faded. She recalled being told an album was coming but never receiving new songs to prepare. By the time she entered the studio, producers simply asked her to sing whatever she performed live. That really isn't the way to do an album, she admitted. The confession revealed the truth. Brunswick, like Epic before them, didn't invest in her the way they should have. There was, however, a glimmer of hope. Desperate for her career to take shape, Irma turned to her sister Aretha. By then, Aretha Franklin had become the undisputed queen of soul, dominating charts with Respect and Chain of Fools. When Irma confided her struggles, Aretha didn't hesitate. She offered to produce her sister's next record herself. Both Aretha and Carolyn began writing songs specifically for Irma, even preparing to fly a 24-piece band to Chicago at their own expense. For a moment, it seemed as though destiny was finally aligning in Irma's favor, but tragedy struck again. Just as sessions were being planned, Aretha's close friend, saxophonist King Curtis, was murdered in New York. Aretha was devastated, and the project was put on hold. When the family tried to regroup weeks later, Brunswick pulled the plug entirely, insisting they had their own producers and refusing Aretha's involvement. For Irma, it was the ultimate betrayal. Once more, the chance to step out of the shadows and stand on her own was stolen not only by personal tragedy, but by industry politics. The frustration of seeing yet another opportunity vanish was almost too much to bear. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, Irma Franklin had fought, clawed, and sung her way toward stardom multiple times. Each time, the door opened just enough to let her glimpse what could be only for it to slam shut. Soul Sister was supposed to cement her as a force in soul music. Instead, it became a bittersweet reminder of what might have been. By the early 1,970 seconds, the shine of Soul Sister had already begun to fade. For Irma Franklin, each victory seemed destined to dissolve before it could harden into permanence. She had talent. She had a Grammy nomination. She even had an international hit. But the industry had never truly believed in her, and that disbelief weighed heavier with each passing year. Still, Irma was no quitter. If record executives couldn't or wouldn't carry her voice to the masses, she would keep carrying it herself. Through 1,969 and 1,970, she toured relentlessly, bringing her sound to stages that Columbia, Epic, and Brunswick had never secured for her. In the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Italy, Germany, across West Africa and the Caribbean, Irma stood before audiences who didn't know her history of false starts and broken promises. All they knew was the voice in front of them, and they applauded with a reverence that reminded her why she sang. In the United States, she appeared at legendary venues: the Apollo Theater in Harlem, Lincoln Center, Town Hall in New York, Miami's famed Coconut Grove. Reviewers praised her power and sincerity, marveling at how she transformed familiar covers into urgent declarations of soul. In those moments, Irma wasn't someone's sister, wasn't someone's background singer, she was the star. And yet, applause doesn't pay the bills. Touring, no matter how successful, couldn't replace the steady momentum that only a committed label could provide. Without consistent releases, radio promotion, or charting singles, Irma's career remained precarious. The cycle repeated: she would dazzle live audiences, then return home to silence from the industry. Slowly, inevitably, the grind wore her down. By the mid-1,970 seconds, Irma had reached her limit. Years of disappointments, of promises dangled, then snatched away, had taken their toll. She stepped back from the dream that had guided her since childhood. The gospel fire still burned in her throat, but her spirit was weary. She chose to redirect her energy. Her education, the business degree her father had once insisted she pursue, became her safety net. Irma began working for IBM, where her discipline and intelligence quickly set her apart. Later, she dedicated herself to Boysville of Michigan, a nonprofit organization serving children and families in need. For more than 30 years, she worked there, eventually rising to the role of copywriter in the Department of Community Relations. To some, this looked like retreat, as if Irma Franklin had abandoned music for stability. But to those who knew her, it was resilience. She wasn't a failure. She wasn't bitter. She had chosen a life of dignity over the endless cycle of disappointment that the industry had dealt her. And in that choice, she embodied a strength that few could see but many would benefit from. Yet the stage was never far away. Even as she pursued her new career and raised her 2 children, Irma returned to music when it mattered most, especially when it meant standing beside her sisters. Whether harmonizing behind Aretha in the studio or lifting her voice in community events, Irma remained tethered to the song that had defined her since childhood. Her journey through the 1,970 seconds revealed the heart of her conflict, a voice that demanded the spotlight, and an industry that repeatedly denied her the stage. It was a tug-of-war between destiny and denial, between what should have been and what was. And through it all, Irma carried herself with the same quiet grace that had defined her from the start. Though Irma Franklin had stepped away from the exhausting chase for stardom, music never fully released its hold on her. Through the 1,980 seconds, she quietly returned to the studio, not as the headliner she once dreamed of being, but as a trusted voice supporting her sister. On Aretha Franklin's 1982 comeback album Jump to It, Irma's harmonies stitched warmth into the arrangements. Later, on the gospel project, One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism, recorded live in 1987 at New Bethel Baptist Church, the same Detroit sanctuary where the sisters' journeys began, Irma's voice rose again in the choir. It was a full-circle moment, both beautiful and heartbreaking. Here was a woman who once earned her own Grammy nomination, blending her voice into the background of her younger sister's glory. And yet, there was no bitterness. Irma loved Aretha deeply. The two remained close throughout their lives. For those who understood the history, seeing Irma fade into harmony lines was painful. But to Irma, standing beside family mattered more than standing alone in the spotlight. Her presence wasn't confined to music. In 1990, she appeared with Aretha at the massive rally welcoming Nelson Mandela to Detroit's Tiger Stadium, lending her voice to a moment that fused music and political history. Nearly a decade later, in 1999, the Franklin sisters appeared together on The Oprah Winfrey Show. Irma, Aretha, and Carolyn performed a medley of classics, La Di Da Di, Hush Hush, and Shotgun, as a tribute to their late father, Reverend C.L. Franklin. The performance was joyous yet tinged with memory, the 3 daughters harmonizing as they once had in their father's church. During that appearance, Oprah teased Irma about always being known as Aretha's sister. Aretha interrupted, firm and protective. "No, they say that's Miss Irma, and she's her own woman." It was a rare public acknowledgement of what those closest to the Franklin family already knew. Irma's legacy could never be measured solely against her siblings. She was not a shadow, but a presence of her own. But even as these moments offered recognition, a darker chapter was unfolding. In the spring of 2002, Irma was diagnosed with throat cancer. The disease advanced quickly, despite treatment. On the 7th of September 2002, she passed away at her home in Detroit. She was just 64 years old. Her funeral was solemn, attended by those who understood the quiet strength she embodied. She was laid to rest at Woodlawn Cemetery, the same final resting place where her famous sister Aretha would join her years later. Obituaries noted her achievements, but too often framed them in relation to her younger sibling, once more reducing her story to a footnote. Those who truly followed her journey knew the deeper truth. Irma Franklin had endured a career defined by near misses, by promises broken and moments stolen. Yet she never surrendered her dignity. She gave her strength to her children, her community, and her faith. Her voice remained immortal, even when her name was too often forgotten. This was the essence of Irma Franklin's conflict. A woman whose brilliance was undeniable, yet constantly pushed aside by circumstance and industry. A woman who lived without bitterness, who carried herself with grace, and who left behind a legacy stronger than the recognition she received. By the late 1980s, Irma Franklin had settled into what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary life. She worked faithfully at Boysville of Michigan, raised her 2 children, and occasionally sang background vocals for Aretha. But as with so many parts of her journey, fate was not finished with her story. This time, for once, destiny tilted in her favor. In 1992, nearly a quarter century after she first recorded it, Irma's version of Piece of My Heart resurfaced in the most unlikely of places, a Levi's jeans commercial in the United Kingdom. In an era when advertisements could propel songs back into the charts, her voice suddenly filled British living rooms, not as a background singer, not as Aretha's sister, but as herself. The reaction was electric. Listeners, many of whom had only ever known Janis Joplin's explosive rock rendition, were stunned to discover the raw, restrained gospel power of the original. Irma's single was reissued and climbed to number 10 bi Deshin Hum, 9 on the UK singles chart, giving her the first true international hit of her career at the age of 54. For a brief, shining moment, the world finally recognized the voice that had been buried for so long. Sony Music capitalized on the momentum, releasing a 3-track CD compilation featuring Piece of My Heart, Every Time We Say Goodbye, and Love Is Blind. A promotional video was even produced. Irma, elegant and smiling, lip-syncing Piece of My Heart in a Detroit soup kitchen on the 25th of October 1992. Watching the clip today feels both exhilarating and bittersweet. Exhilarating because she finally stood alone before the camera, the rightful owner of a song that had become immortal. Bittersweet because recognition had arrived decades too late. In interviews, Irma admitted she was shocked by the resurgence. She couldn't believe that a song from 1967 was suddenly finding new life, and yet she welcomed the vindication. For years, she had carried the quiet knowledge that her performance mattered, that her recording deserved more. Now, an entire new audience was hearing what she had always known. What makes this moment resonate so powerfully is the contrast between Irma's interpretation and Joplin's, where Janis screamed with chaotic abandon, Irma sang with dignity, poise, and the ache of lived experience. Her version was the voice of a woman who knew heartbreak intimately, not theatrically. Both renditions hold power, but they represent different worlds. Joplin's anarchic fire and Franklin's soulful endurance. For decades, only one of those worlds was remembered. The Levi's ad shifted that balance, however briefly, and gave Irma her rightful place in the conversation. Still, even this revival carried the fingerprints of celebrity underrated. Irma wasn't celebrated as a pioneer in her own time, but rediscovered by chance through the marketing strategy of a commercial. Recognition came, but it came as a rediscovery, almost an accident, and yet, for her, it was enough. After a lifetime of watching opportunities vanish, here was proof that her voice still had power, that the song she first carried to life would always belong to her. The 1,990 seconds also brought symbolic moments of acknowledgement. Standing beside Aretha and Carolyn on the Oprah Winfrey Show in 1999, Irma participated in a medley honoring their late father. The performance was joyful, familial, and deeply poignant. When Oprah teased Irma about being known as Aretha's sister, Aretha shut it down immediately. "No, they say that's Miss Irma, and she's her own woman." In that single declaration, Aretha validated what Irma's career had always proven, yet history had so often ignored that she was not a shadow but a soul singer of rare power. Irma's legacy, then, is not simply one of missed opportunities, it is one of resilience. She was the first Franklin sister to record, the first to give the world Piece of My Heart, and a woman who carried both gospel fire and soul elegance in her voice. She built a life outside the industry, dedicating herself to community service, to children, to family. She showed that dignity mattered more than charts, that strength could endure even when the spotlight refused to shine. When she passed away in 2002, obituaries too often placed Aretha at the center of the narrative. But those who knew Irma's journey understood the deeper truth. She was not merely Aretha's sister. She was Miss Irma, her own woman, her own artist, her own story. Her legacy lives in two strands: the music that soul enthusiasts continue to rediscover, and the decades of community work that touched lives far beyond the stage. Together, they paint a portrait of a woman whose worth was never dependent on fame. Irma Franklin's life reminds us to look beyond the shadows, to honor those whose brilliance history overlooked. Her voice was timeless, her dignity was unshakable. And though she never wore the crown, she remains unforgettable. She was the first to breathe life into Piece of My Heart, long before Janis Joplin roared it across the counterculture. She was the eldest Franklin sister, the one whose voice could shake the walls of a sanctuary, yet whose name was too often missing from the marquee. Irma Franklin never wore the crown, but she carried the heart of soul music in her chest, offering it generously even when the world looked away. Her story is the very definition of celebrity underrated. Time and again, she approached the threshold of greatness. A record contract, a breakthrough single, a Grammy nomination, each could have been the doorway to lasting fame. And time and again, the door closed, whether through industry indifference, tragic timing, or the towering shadow of her younger sister. For every chance she was given, fate seemed to demand a price. And yet, Irma never succumbed to bitterness. She chose dignity over despair, service over spotlight. She raised her children, built a career in community work, and lent her voice to causes larger than herself. Even as the world celebrated others for the song she first made immortal, she carried herself with quiet strength. When her version of Piece of My Heart resurfaced in the 1990 seconds, decades after its release, it was a vindication not just for her, but for every overlooked talent whose brilliance history tries to bury. It reminded us that recognition can be delayed, but never fully denied. So what do we make of Irma Franklin's life? Should she be remembered only as Aretha's sister, or as the rightful originator of one of soul's greatest anthems? Should history keep her in the margins, or elevate her to the pantheon where she belongs? Those questions remain, but they demand an answer. One truth, however, is undeniable. Miss Irma was her own woman. She may never have stood as queen, but she remains unforgettable, a soul singer of rare power whose voice deserves to be heard, whose dignity deserves to be honored. This is the essence of Irma Franklin's legacy: timeless, underrated, unforgettable.